term, it's used in different ways, and how useful it is for you to decide. As Astrid Henry argues, quote, the ways in which historical moments, ideology and age are frequently conflated with the third way of discourse complicates any easy separation of the term's meanings. Okay, so having talked a little bit about the third wave as a concept, I'm now going to move on to talk about the move from identity politics to post-structuralist feminisms. And it is very much feminisms, not feminism, because there are lots of different positions within it, and different positions tend to develop on the basis of which post-structuralist theories people are working with. So whether they're working with Foucault or Derrida or Deleuze or whatever. Or Lacanian psychoanalysis in some cases. So by the 1980s, post-structuralist theory had been taken up by many feminists, and ideas of groundless solidarity that did not rest on, but did not rest on specific fixed identities were beginning to come to the fore. Now this concept of groundless solidarity, I'm going to give you a definition from Diane Eland's book in a moment, but what it means is, feminist politics had, in the early phases of second wave feminism, definitely been grounded on the body, women's body and women's difference. Actually, a lot of the campaigning was not grounded on the body at all, it was grounded on issues. So issues of equal pay, issues of access to abortion, issues of childcare, those sort of issues that the women's movement took up. What groundless solidarity means is that you don't assume a shared understanding of women or a shared understanding of difference. What you assume is a shared political agenda. So it's a politics, again, based on a shared political agenda. Then groundless solidarity is the possibility, this is a quote from Diane Eland, groundless solidarity is the possibility of a community which is not grounded in the truth of a pre-social identity. Solidarity forms the basis, although not the foundation, for political action and ethical responsibility. So it's a move radically away from identity politics. You do not need to be lesbian to fight for lesbian rights. You do not need to be black to fight to transform racism. What you need is a shared project of what you want to change. That is to say, groundless solidarity is a stability, so it gives you a basis from which to work, but not an absolute one. It can be the object of conflict and need not mean consensus. So you don't have to agree. You don't have to agree on everything. What you need to agree on is that you want to change something. There is a sense in which groundless solidarity could be said to constitute a moral community, but only in a very limited and restricted sense. And what does that mean? Well, a moral community in the sense that you think something is oppressive. You think that domestic violence is something bad. So your moral judgment about domestic violence is this shouldn't happen in our society, and therefore you campaign on the basis of that moral community of like-minded people who may not agree with you at all about the nature of woman or anything else, but agree that domestic violence is not a good thing, And that means that you can bring in a much wider body of people. Because obviously if your issue is domestic violence, you can bring in Christian feminists as well as radical lesbian feminists, people whose actual positions are radically at odds. This notion of community could not be equated with organic totality or have a natural foundation any more than it would lay claim to absolute solidarity. A community of groundless solidarity could cross natural borders, just as it might be the meeting place for any number of different ethnicities, religious affiliations and sexualities, for instance. Groundless solidarity, then, could be understood as a political coalition brought together on the basis of shared ethical commitments, but it would make no claim to inclusiveness. Okay? So a sort of very much a fairly sort of difficult way of putting across a fairly simple idea. Yeah. Already in the 1970s, post-structuralist theories of meaning, subjectivity and power had begun to radically challenge approaches to difference, which are seen as grounded in biology, human nature, and/or universal structures of the psyche. So all those ideas about gender grounded in human nature, in biology, in human nature, or in structures of the psyche, so psychoanalytic. Really, certainly in Britain, the influence of post-structuralist theories goes back to the beginning of the 1970s, and it really takes off big time by the mid-1970s. A lot of it's taken up in relation to film studies. It's a very important journal called Screen, which took up all these ideas of all this quite difficult theory from France and looked at it. Often termed postmodern, this post-structuralist theory, which draws primarily on the works of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, has challenged the foundational status of the body as the guarantee of racial or gender difference or sexuality. So I'll just read that bit again, it's quite hard. In the early phases, it was very much Derrida and Foucault. Later on, we have Deleuze coming in and other theorists, and we have the development of a radical French feminism, which is post-structuralist, in the work of Cixous and Irigaray to some extent, only to some extent, and Julia Kristeva, who was a Bulgarian feminist located in France. So often termed postmodern, this post-structuralist theory, which draws primarily on the works of Derrida and Foucault, has challenged the foundational status of the body. In other words, the body is guaranteeing what you are and who you are, as a guarantee of both racial or gender difference or sexuality. In other words, the body doesn't determine who you are in terms of your gender or your sexuality in any sort of natural way. So race, gender and sexuality are discursively produced, is the argument. We'll come back to that. Just an aside, postmodern and post-structuralist. For postmodern, I think you could say postmodern is the broader term for the way of thinking. Yeah? So the postmodern critique is, as I mentioned the other day, is the critique of what are called meta-narratives, the critique of general theories. Yeah? Like the liberal humanist belief in progress through education, or like the Marxist theory of the economics, which, the idea that Marxist economics can actually explain everything. It's not to say those theories aren't useful, or that politically they might be essential. You could argue, for example, that liberal humanist notions of education and freedom through education and human rights, all the rest of it that comes out of that tradition, are really important. But, of course, what you then have to acknowledge is that they change, okay? So our ideas of what human rights are change. The sort of agenda that is taken up by an institution like the United Nations is clearly not about things that are fixed and universal in practice. It's about ideas that work out in different ways in different periods. Post-structuralist is the word that applies to the theories because they come after structuralism and they develop as a critique of structuralism. Okay, so that's why it's called post-structuralist. The range of theories usually described as postmodern include in particular the work of Lyotard. Lyotard is really important for his critique in the postmodern condition of meta-narratives, and Baudrillard, who wrote a lot about postmodern culture as surface and having no essence and no sort of substance. It's obviously a term that's much easier to think in a media age. Yeah? Not all commentators would call Derrida or Foucault postmodern, and this term, they would obviously call them post-structuralists, they might not call them postmodern, and this is a term that Derrida himself refused when it was applied to his work on deconstruction. Nonetheless, a strong argument can be made that the different forms of post-structuralist theory share a postmodern impulse in their approach to language, meaning, subjectivity, and power. So those are the key things that we need to look at. Language, meaning, subjectivity, and power. Above all, they challenge ideas of fixed meaning, that a word means what it says. There is no fixed meaning. Unified subjectivity. Subjectivity isn't just rational consciousness, and even rational consciousness isn't unified. And centered theories of power. In other words, that's the Foucauldian critique of power, that power isn't always top down. It doesn't come necessarily from above, and it's not imposed from above. It comes from below. We'll come back to that. Post-structuralist theory has been taken up by many within feminism and queer studies as an effective tool for understanding subjectivity, sexuality, gender, and society, and for devising strategies for change. However, post-structuralist theory remains controversial and continues to be attacked on various counts, particularly by radical feminists. As somebody mentioned yesterday, this idea of post-structuralism not giving you a position from which to be an active political agent, because it's constantly deconstructing and it's laying out the power relations. Post-structuralism works very much with the idea that there is a distinction between theory and politics. And post-structuralist analysis is very much the precondition for an informed, theoretically informed politics. In other words, what it does is it maps the power relations. It maps the discursive field and the institutions that structure that field. It maps those power relations, and on the basis of that, you can then have a better idea of what you might do, how you might intervene to begin to shift them. And it's concerned very much with small changes. We talked about that yesterday. In other words, you can't go out and change the world. You can go out and change, but you can change things in smaller units. You can have an effect. So this lecture then looks at post-structuralist feminism and queer theory, their conceptions of difference, and their implications for feminism as a broad-based political movement. I examine a number of key issues raised by post-structuralism and its feminist and queer advocates and critics. These include gender, sexuality, the body and subjectivity. Gender, sexuality, the body and subjectivity. Identity, difference, and the category woman. Feminist narratives, pluralism and relativism. And then discourse, power and the body. Gender as performance, queer, and postmodern politics. Okay? Some of you are. Just stop there for a moment if you're trying to take notes. All right? Post-structuralist theory has challenged all theories of sexual and gender difference which appeal to the fixed meanings of bodies. The basis for this challenge is the assumption that there is no such thing as natural or given meanings in the world. This is the important point. This is the grounding principle of queer. Nothing is natural. Okay? Everything is cultural, social and cultural. Or in the feminist context, there is no such thing as a natural woman. Going right back to the beginning, to Simone de Beauvoir, woman is made. Yeah? She's not born. Woman isn't born. You're not born a woman, you become a woman in a culture. Okay? The basis then for this challenge is the assumption that there is no such thing as natural or given meaning in the world. Language doesn't reflect reality. This is the basic post-structuralist point. Language does not reflect reality, but it gives it meaning. Yeah? So it's culture, It's language in its specific culture that names things, okay? And it names things in different ways, and it's contested. Meanings are contested. If you think about woman, think about all the different meanings that different people within a society attribute to a female body. Okay, it's a contested site. Meaning is an effect of language. In other words, there is no meaning without language. There is nothing inherent in a thing, yeah, that makes it what it is. Its meaning comes through through language. It's not that there isn't a real world. There is obviously an object here. I'm sitting on one, and at one. But what we call it and what it means is cultural, okay? And if I say to you chair, and you think about all the different forms of seating that you could have, if you looked at all the different cultures that exist, they'll all come under this sort of general thing of chair. So it means an effect of language, and as such it's always historically and culturally specific. Yeah? So it changes with history, and it changes between cultures. Moreover, meaning can never be fixed once and for all, so that you cannot fix meaning. It is the effect of what Jacques Derrida calls différence, that's his concept. And what he means by différence is a process of difference, so it's different. So language means through its difference from other signifiers. So a word is a signifier. It's not that there is an intrinsic meaning in a particular signifier. Its meaning comes from its difference from other signifiers in the chain. So you cannot think, for example, woman without thinking man, okay? Because that's the basis of the difference in the culture, okay? And that's where this notion of binaries comes in again, which we had early on with Siksu. So différence is a process of difference and deferral. What does deferral mean? Well, deferral means that, in order to say something, in order for you to understand what I'm saying, I'm fixing meaning, yeah? But if you reproduce what I've been saying in your essays, it probably won't mean exactly the same thing. You might use it slightly differently or whatever. So although you can fix meaning, you can only fix it temporarily. And it's constantly subject to change, to différence, to the process of différence. It's constantly becoming something else. And this différence and difference and deferral ensures that any fixing is a temporary retrospective effect. Derrida has further argued that meaning tends to be structured in terms of hierarchical binary oppositions, such as male, female, black, white, primitive, advanced, and so on. The fact that language is plural, that signifiers have no one fixed meaning, means that there are many competing definitions of gender difference. And following Foucault, these meanings are produced within a range of institutionally located discourses, such as medicine, psychology, religion, fashion, advertising, literature, media, and the arts, just to name some of them. So all these are institutions which give rise to discourses. They produce discourses that are contested, and often, there are going to be contradictions between them. But they are located, these institutions in the society, they're located in a hierarchy of power relations. Okay? So some have more status than others. Some have more power than others. So from post-structuralist perspectives, the meanings ascribed to bodies are culturally produced, plural, and ever-changing. Moreover, these competing meanings are part of broader relations of power that have implications for both women and men. They affect femininity and masculinity as forms of lived and embodied subjectivity, and women and men's positions in society. The meanings of different bodies at particular moments in history are thus sites of struggle, in which men and women's interests are at stake. Yeah? So if you think about, let's take, I get an example I already mentioned. In 19th century Germany, in 19th century Germany, the progressive, in inverted commas, position was women are equal but different. Yeah? So their bodies meant that they were fitted for different roles within society. Okay? But this is a contested notion. Yeah? So on the conservative end of that equal but difference would be the position that that women shouldn't have access to higher education because that will undermine their ability to be good mothers. I think we talked about that before. Yeah? And obviously there are interests at stake in whether or not you think that women's bodies mean that everything should be directed towards motherhood and that implies that other things are impossible. Okay, these are obviously very outmoded ideas now. But the idea that, that child care, not childbirth, I mean, we haven't reached the science fiction sort of idea of, and like you find in some novels of the 70s and 80s of, machines producing children and all the rest of it. But the idea of who's responsible for bringing up children, who is the primary, I mean, all the evidence shows that children, all the scientific evidence shows that children need a primary, need people who are the primary carers, but it doesn't show that that has to be the mother. And that's the debate then around whether gay couples, for example, particularly gay male couples, should be allowed to have children. Okay? Which certainly in Britain is perfectly possible. If you're a gay couple, you can have a child. Now obviously two men aren't going to produce a child, but they, producing the child and bringing up the child are seen as separate things. Mm-hmm. And so one of the very first people I ever supervised, his PhD way back when, who now is really quite an important, he produces really important documentaries for television. He has 2 children, and he had those children with he and his partner, who's a man. There he had friends who were a lesbian couple, so they had children. He and one of the lesbian women had these 2 children, and they share the families, okay? So the children have 2 families. They have the lesbian couple, but they live with the gay male couple, okay? And that's perfectly possible. But it means that you have to detach your thinking that it is actually women who are primarily, the carers for children. Okay. And obviously, this is highly contested. I mean, Britain is a relatively secular society these days, which is why these sorts of things are possible. If you think about America, where where religion and certainly conservative forms of Christianity are very, very powerful politically, even the idea of gay marriage, let alone gay people bringing up children, is much harder to push through. Okay? To insist, for example, that the meanings of woman are neither singular nor stable and are effects of power, including class and racial power, is to suggest that what it means to be a woman varies. And this is the sort of theoretical underpinning, if you like, for what we were talking about yesterday in relation to, sort of black feminist critiques of white feminism. So once you say the meaning of woman is an effect of power, including class and racial power, it suggests that what it means to be a woman varies, and what a black woman in America is subject to is different from the experience of a white woman in America. Take America as an example, it would be true in lots of other countries, but it's very clear, and because it's constantly in the news, certainly I suspect it's constantly in the news here with all these sort of cases of police violence and so on. It's what you can see it is still acted out literally on the streets. Okay, in the if you think about, I don't know, does the Black Lives Matter campaign that they've had in the States, does that get coverage in the Korean media? You know, all these protests around the killing of young black men, unarmed, mostly unarmed, by policemen. Yeah. I mean, it's constantly, certainly, it's constantly covered now by CNN. I don't know if you get CNN. Certainly the hotel I'm in doesn't have CNN. But, it has BBC World and Al Jazeera, but not CNN, which is quite interesting. I don't know why. This is not, however, to suggest that the particular socially and culturally produced forms of gendered subjectivity do not contain elements which may be shared by women across classes, races and cultures. So again, you know, some elements of the radical feminist project of global sisterhood, they still work, yeah? You can share experience because there are shared experiences. If you think of things like domestic violence or rape, yeah? Happen in all cultures. And being raped, the meanings of might be slightly different in different cultures. I mean, it must, you know, we were talking yesterday about comfort women, or the day before, I can't remember which day. If you think about what is so important about that whole issue, you could argue, yes, it was horrible, but equally as important is how it is then seen by the society. Yeah? So the fact that those women are then rejected as what somebody called, you know, spoiled goods or whatever. Yeah? So how do the victims of rape, how are they treated by the society? It's really, really crucial. It's not, nor is it to suggest that particular forms of embodied, gendered subjectivity are somehow inauthentic and not lived as real. So yes, you live your subjectivity, and you live it as real, yeah? But it doesn't have any guarantees in some sort of natural order. Ideas of true femininity and true masculinity are replaced by competing discursive constructions of gender. And there's, you know, that's another sort of, that's another possible essay, really, you know, but probably not one that you would want to do because we haven't done enough on it. But if you thought about what are the implications of feminist critique of femininity for rethinking masculinity, yeah? So challenging the idea that masculinity is natural and seeing masculinity as a social construct, yeah? Then the sort of debates that we've had in some of the discussions, you know, about the role of institutions in producing particular forms of masculinity, like the army, yeah? Or like religion, yeah? It's quite interesting. So it's not just femininity that's at issue here, it's also masculinity, and they're replaced by competing discursive constructions of gender. And in the work that's been done on masculinity, certainly in Britain, what people have done a lot of work using a broadly Foucauldian perspective to look at how very different institutions, such as the army, such as sport, you think about, sport is very gendered, certainly in Western Europe. I imagine it's very gendered here too, yeah? If you think about the sort of sports that are seen as masculine sports versus feminine sports and all the rest of it. How gender, or even something as basic as physical education in schools, yeah? How that produces different notions of femininity and masculinity, of the female body and the male body. Okay? All that. That's a sort of broadly Foucauldian approach to questions of masculinity and femininity. They're replaced by competing discursive constructions, yeah? And discourse here, and I'll come on to that in a moment, discourse here is material, yeah? It's not just how you talk, but it's the whole institutional framework, yeah? I'll come back to that. There's no authentic female subjectivity to be found somewhere beyond discourse or beyond patriarchal ideology, as some early feminists suggested. The fundamental post-structuralist idea that discourses produce meaning and subjectivity rather than reflecting on them makes language and subjectivity ongoing sites of struggle, of political struggle. If you think right back to when I was talking about consciousness-raising groups, now consciousness-raising groups were also, if you like, part of this, but it was a very early part of this. So you talk about your experience and you identify that it's not just individual, it's social. It's both individual and social. And therefore, that's a liberating experience because it suggests that it's the social power relations, the social institutions that are producing the problems that you have. Yeah? And there your subjectivity changes, you see yourself differently, and this is a liberating experience that gives you a sense of agency. So you don't have to accept it, you can change it. Okay? This struggle involves both the defining and contesting of difference in discourses which have different degrees of power to shape social relations. In post-structuralist approaches which draw on the work of Foucault, discourse is more than linguistic meanings. That's what I've just been saying. It's not just language. It's material in the sense that it is located in institutions and practices which define differences and shape the material world, including bodies. And we can go back to the example we just had of sport. If you think about the gendering of sport or the gendering of physical education and the way it actually shapes bodies in particular ways. Yeah? Think about cultural forms like dance, for example. That's highly gendered. Now, obviously, that's an extreme example. But the materiality of discourse is written into the environment, for example. It goes much, if you think about the structure of courtroom, for example, the power relations of the courtroom are actually written into the architectural structures. That's what's meant by it. It's material. Yeah, it's not just saying things. It actually organizes the materiality of the society. And mostly, it works on the basis of consent. Sometimes you need coercion. Okay, and that's if you think about prisons, or if you think about sort of repressive apparatuses, to use an Althusserian term, that's when sort of a strong arm of the law or whatever comes in. So it shapes the material world, including bodies. For example, dominant 19th century discourses of femininity, which among other things denied middle-class women access to higher education, professions and public life, also prescribed the forms that girls' education should take. This had material implications for their physical, intellectual and emotional development. You must have seen, surely I imagine you must have seen dramatizations like the BBC or film versions of 19th century novels about middle-class girls, like Jane Austen's novels, for example, constantly being filmed and refilmed, Pride and Prejudice. Anyone not seen a visual representation, a visual version of Pride and Prejudice? Yeah? And you think about what the education of girls of that class in that period was about. It was about learning to play the piano, learning to draw, sort of what was seen as the feminine arts. It wasn't about having a proper, sort of grounded, intellectually based education. This had material implications for their physical, intellectual and emotional development. So this form of education, the argument is, shapes bodies, it shapes minds, and it shapes emotions in particular ways. So also emotions, okay? Emotions from a post-structuralist position aren't natural either, in the sense that how they're expressed and where they're expressed is a cultural phenomenon and it changes, okay? This is a sort of very counterintuitive argument, and as I mentioned earlier in the week, affect, what are now called affect studies, the study of emotion, is sort of a developing area within cultural studies, within gender studies. The argument being that actually emotion is always there in one form or another, and it has real effects, okay? And it's tied to particular, for example, gender norms. So domestic violence. Why domestic violence? What you have to look at the emotions that motivate domestic violence and the reason for those emotions, which you could argue are linked to ideas of masculinity and femininity and and when those come into conflict, it's just an example. So, in the 19th century then, education shaped bodies, minds and emotions in particular ways which were thought to be conducive to women's apparently natural roles as wives and mothers. They also defined female modesty in ways that precluded any useful knowledge of the female body and female sexuality. In Victorian Britain, they say, they even covered the legs of the pianos, so that, people, out of modesty or whatever. The idea of showing your leg, in Victorian Britain, in certain classes, obviously, was seen as immodest. Okay? And the idea, and this relates, of course, to the idea of a particular construction of female sexuality, which is, a Foucauldian perspective would say, well, if women were naturally modest and asexual and were a bit like the Sleeping Beauty and needed a man to come along to awaken their sexuality, you wouldn't have to have all these measures in society to make sure that they were like that. Okay, you wouldn't have to be constantly keeping women away from, protecting women from anything to do with sexuality. Yeah? Okay. So these processes formed the subjectivity of girls and women as embodied subjects in ways which often promoted physical, mental, and emotional problems. And this is precisely what lots of those 19th century novels are about. Yeah? Without putting it in the sort of modern terms that I'm talking about it. If you think about Pride and Prejudice, for example, and how it's resolved, it can only be resolved by a change on both sides, yeah? Both the heroine and the hero. Okay. And certainly contemporary romance, I don't know about romance in Korea, but certainly romance in the West and also in Thailand, because that's, there, it's shifted. I mean, in Thailand, for example, it's really interesting. This is a work that came from a Thai PhD student I had who was working on changing romance in Thai culture, how it came in from the West and how it changed in a Thai cultural context, but how you can actually see, if she compared the 40s, 50s with the 70s and the 90s, and you can actually see how, the structures of it and the norms that it's putting forward change. And they change, you can relate that back to changes in Thai society, in particular sort of more involvement of women in the workforce. And we talk about middle class women here, because obviously working class, peasant women were always very central to the work. But it changes, shifts what the heroines are like and how they behave. It shifts how sexual they are and how to what extent they can express sexuality in the text. Okay? And I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine that you could trace maybe similar, changes in Thai romance, in Korean romance. I don't know. Does anybody read romance here? Anyone going to own up to reading popular romances? None of you read ever? Did you used to when you were teenagers? No? Yeah, okay. You're not romantic films, nothing?
The TV soap operas?
Yeah, TV soap operas is another good example.
Yeah. Korean TV soap operas targeted for, women or other genre.
And I mean, you're old enough, if you excuse me saying,
yes,
to have noticed changes.
Changes.
You think there have been changes?
I don't know. I'm not huge fan of the soap operas, but still, these contemporary dramas are notorious for their building up of a very stereotyped women's role.
Yeah. No, it may well be that they haven't changed. I'm not saying they necessarily have changed. It may be that, for specific reasons about Korean society that they absolutely don't change, but it would be interesting to know,
In the past, the soap operas were more geared into building up the traditional family types.
Yeah.
More bonding among family members and among neighborhoods. But these days, the majority of Korean dramas, they deal with those all broken relationship is unnatural. Conflicts or so it seems to show the symptom of family all broken down and material greed. So they seem to show the aspects of Korean society that change in society.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think the image of women, especially in romantic relationships on TV, it has definitely changed throughout the years. Well, before it was more focused on, in a romantic relationship, especially more focused on the love, how the woman is actually subjugated by the man, but then nowadays the woman they slap. And they have more power. Definitely they do have more power over the relationship, whereas before they didn't.
I mean, I sometimes put the television on in the hotel, and you get these costume dramas set in whenever, I don't know when they're set, but in traditional, very traditional Korean society with the everybody in those costumes. There seems to be an awful lot of, I mean, I get the sense of what's going on just from the way in which, there seems to be, like women betraying other women and, leading to people being badly treated and thrown out of the court and all the rest of it. So it is quite interesting. I think popular culture is actually it is always a very sort of, although it's relatively simple, it's quite a rich site for looking at how things change or don't change. And certainly cultural studies has focused a lot on popular culture, and not just sort of cinema, but what's really interesting in a particular society is the things that are home produced rather than produced in America or somewhere else. So the things that are actually in this society specifically for a Korean audience, and what are the values that they're putting across, what are the images of gender they're putting across. The structuralist theory suggests that not only meaning, but also individual subjectivity is produced within discourse. Discourses define what it means to be a woman or a man, and the available range of gender, appropriate and transgressive behaviour. So we've moved away here from that, enlightened idea of the sovereign subject. I know, I think, therefore I am, Descartes, I know, to I speak what the culture allows me to speak. Obviously I have agency in the sense that I'm I am confronted with all sorts of different competing discourses within which I would take up a position. That position may change, people change as they come across, different ways of thinking, different ways of behaving. So, but the important point is that subjectivity, individual subjectivity, is produced within discourse. Now, this is often read by critics of this type of theory as meaning that you're no longer an agent. The argument is that yes, you are still an agent, but you're an agent who is taking up positions, between discourses or from the clash of discourses, where they don't, where they offer radically different subject positions, something new emerges. Okay. Discourses define what it means to be a woman or a man, and the available range of gender, appropriate and transgressive behaviour. We learn who we are, how to think and behave through discursive practices. Moreover, subjectivity is embodied, and discursive practices shape our bodies, as well as our minds and emotions, in socially gendered ways. In post-structuralism, the individual is never fully coherent, never a fully coherent intentional subject, as in the liberal tradition. The individual is the site for competing and often contradictory modes of subjectivity. So that's just another way of saying what I've just said about how you're not a sovereign subject. You are the site of competing and contradictory modes of subjectivity, which together constitute a particular person. And this then is the basis for the idea that we touched on yesterday, of how you can have multiple, sometimes contradictory identities, and multiple and contradictory, like you can like things that are really, that, you can emotionally be engaged by things that you might intellectually think are bad for you. Yeah? So, you can really assume, move within and become, engaged by traditional romantic discourses when you're watching a film or something, which intellectually you would wish to, or actually to critique as not very progressive in relation to women. So it's a complex and contradictory formation. So subjectivity is embodied, and discursive practices then shape bodies, minds and emotions in socially gendered ways. In post-structuralism, the individual is never fully coherent, so you don't expect an individual to be coherent, and the older you get, people, the more you realise that, what people say one day or argue one day isn't necessarily what they're going to say and argue the next day, and that, people have positions that aren't coherent, but that isn't because they're, that's because of this competing, field of discourses within which they're positioned. The individual is the site for competing and often contradictory modes of subjectivity, which together constitute a particular person. Now, sometimes people will espouse a position, very, very rigorously and very, very sort of dogmatically, and won't want to be open to difference, won't want to be open to other positions and to change. Often people want to feel secure. They want to. There's a certain There's a certain sort of power and comfort in having a fixed position. Okay, knowing who you are and what you are and why you are. Yeah, and arguably this is something, for example, that religion offers, or that particular particular types of sometimes particular types of politics offer that. Modes of subjectivity are constituted within discursive practices and lived by the individual as if she or he were fully coherent intentional subjects. So it's not that you don't live yourself necessarily. You don't experience yourself as contradictory, and in the sight of all these competing discourses. You may well experience yourself as coherent, as a sort of intentional coherent subject. But that's the strategy of action in the world. Like I said earlier, in order to speak, in order to act, you have to take up a position. The point about that position is it is a position and it changes. The question of agency. The key question here, posed by many feminist critics of postmodernism, is whether this means that we are mere passive effects of discourse, bereft of agency. Post-structuralist feminists would answer in the negative. They'd say, no, that's not the case. Arguing that it's only by assuming forms of subjectivity which include the dimensions of agency that we can think, communicate, and act in the world. Okay, I want to move on then to discourse, power, and the body, Foucauldian perspectives. This is a quote from Judith Butler. Have you read Judith Butler? Her ideas are important. Obviously, she's not the clearest of writers. She's quite hard to read. A lot of these theorists are hard to read. They don't have to be, because the ideas are actually quite, can explain them in easier ways. But I'm going to give you a quote from Butler from her book Gender Trouble from 1990. To expose the foundational categories of sex, gender and desire, the foundational, in other words, as if they were naturally given, foundational categories of sex, gender and desire as effects of a specific formation of power, so that rather than being, given, they are effects of power, requires a form of critical inquiry that Foucault, reformulating Nietzsche, designates as genealogy. Genealogy goes back and looks at how historically, position has developed. A genealogical critique refuses to search for the origins of gender, the inner truth of female desire, a genuine or authentic sexual identity that repression has kept from view. Rather, genealogy investigates the political stakes in designating, and this is hard, but just take it slowly, the political stakes in designating as an origin and cause those identity categories that are in fact the effects of institutions, practices, discourse with multiple and diffuse points of origin. So the issue isn't, what are the real basis for these things, but what has emerged in the society as, if it were, what assumes the status of the real basis for, for gender, for sexuality, for race. The same things would hold for race. So the argument is that identity categories, like such as male, female, gay, straight, etc., all these identity categories are effects of institutional practices. They're effects of discourse. They're not the origins as such, and that they have multiple and diffuse points of origin. The task of this inquiry is to centre on and decenter such defining institutions, philo-logocentrism and compulsory heterosexuality. Now, this is really, this is a development from Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1, which is much, much clearer and much easier to understand. So, if you're interested in post-structuralist theory and in relation to women and sexuality, then, I would recommend you read History of Sexuality, Volume 1, much, much more easy to understand. It was the work of Judith Butler in the early 90s, 1993, her two books at this time. It was there that new approaches to embodiment emerged most strongly. So it's an idea of subjectivity as embodied, discourse as material, and the body being an effect of discourse. Butler is critical of philosophy. She is a philosopher. Butler is critical of philosophy's tendency to miss the body, or worse, to write against it. So using Foucault and psychoanalysis, she attempts to theorize the materiality of the body and the ways in which bodies are materialized as sex in the light of critiques of heterosexism. So she takes up, the notion of compulsory heterosexuality that we've already looked at in Adrian Rich's work, and attempts to theorize that from a post-structuralist perspective. She wishes to go beyond the conventional limits of constructionist theories to consider how such constraints not only produce the domain of intelligible bodies, but produce as well a domain of unthinkable, abject, unlivable bodies. So those types of bodies and behaviour that are excluded from, acknowledgement within a society. Starting from the premise that bodies only appear, this is a quote, bodies only appear, only endure, only live within productive constraints of certain highly gendered regulatory schemas. Butler suggests a way of theorizing these schemas via the concept of performativity. And in this early work of hers on gender, performativity is the sort of concept that most people hold on to. In other words, gendered subjectivity is acquired through the repeated performance by the individual of discourses of gender. So, gender isn't within you. There is no grounding within you for gender. Gender is something that you learn through performing it. Okay? Moreover, Butler argues that there's no gender identity behind the expressions of gender identity. Behind the expressions of gender, identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results. So, you know, people think, oh, she behaves like that because she's a woman. Yeah? But the argument is it's not because she's a woman that she behaves like that. It's got to do with discourses of femininity which produce that sort of behaviour. So it's a sort of, you know, it's a refocusing of the argument. So it's the actual performing roles of being a woman that makes you a woman or a man. Okay? And you learn particular modes of gender behaviour. You learn modes of masculinity through the institutions which shape your masculinity and which offer you positions within the discourse of masculinity which a particular institution works with. So if you think about something I mentioned earlier about how it seems, certainly in Western cultures, probably here too, that masculinity is much more policed, that more emphasis is laid on being a proper man than being a proper woman. You know, how, you know, the way, what I said before, how it's okay for a girl to be a tomboy in the West, you know, to behave like a boy when she's young, but not all right for a boy to be a sissy and to behave like a girl. Yeah? And there's always worries when a little boy goes to nursery and starts playing with the dolls and doing all the feminine things. And one of the things, you know, a lot of arguments in social psychology suggest that ideas of discourse of gender are laid down very early in the family and in nurseries, and that they become internalized, they become naturalized, and that, you know, people really worry about their boys not becoming proper men. I'm not saying they don't worry about their girls too, but they don't worry about their girls in quite the same way. So there's no gender identity behind expressions of gender. So it's not your gender body or your some sort of guarantee of your gender identity in the body that's at stake. It's the struggle between particular discourses of gender, which say, in the discursive field, says what's appropriate to men, what's appropriate to women. This performativity must be understood not as a singular or deliberate act, but rather as the reiterative and citational practice by which discourse produces the effects that it names. So it's an ongoing process. Right? It's not a one-out act. You don't suddenly choose, I'm going to be, this type of girl. But it's a constant process, that takes place in all sorts of areas. Think about how to be a good girl in education or in fashion or in how to conform to social norms of what femininity should look like. This is learned behaviour that you perform. Yeah? If you think back to the video that we watched of the bodybuilding, yeah? Well, those bodybuilding versus dieting. Well, both bodybuilding and dieting are material practices that shape your body in a particular way, governed by specific norms of beauty within society, okay? But they're material practices. If you diet, it shapes your body. If you bodybuild, it shapes your body, yeah? Okay, good, break. All right. If you've got questions, we can take them, because after the break, we're going to move on to queer a bit, okay? Now this is, I don't know how familiar you are with this theory, but it's not easy, yeah? I mean, I'm making it as easy as I can, but you just have to read, you have to get your head around it. It requires some work, okay? But I would say it's worth doing, but that's for you to decide.